communist was supposed to practice self-critique in order to yeah, I don't know if it's the right translation.
Yeah, it's what you call the critique, the auto-critique. Is not properly what Foucault would have called a practice of the self, that perhaps can be compared. Yeah, but these are the paradox of the... Once you have this couple, you cannot understand anymore the political activity. But our system is grounded on these two powers. So you will always have a pole who legitimate the other second, and the second who presuppose the first. The first is no more, is never there, is presupposed as a foundation. But without the foundation, you will not have a legitimation.
Yes? I think this is an excellent point, because Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution is a try to keep the constituent power in the constituted power. It's like when Tony Negri in his book Potere Costituente tried to the constituent power is something permanent, is something that is in each act, is each new act. And if you could explain also the notion of violence in Benjamin, when Benjamin said that violence originates the law, violence is constituent power, but at the same time, in the parliaments, in the institutions of the government, there is some kind of consciousness of this violence to keep this constituted power.
Absolutely. Now, what we have, if you go in the history of the recent history of Europe, but already the French Revolution, we have the problem of how we can make present the constituent power, which has the form of the past. How we can make it present. So, Trotsky had this idea of a permanent revolution. Mao Zedong also. Don't say permanent, he says. No, there is a, so remember, there is a little difference between Trotsky and Mao.
Not interrupted.
I don't know, there is a little difference, but the principle, the idea is always the same, to keep alive the constituent power. And Tony Negri wrote a book called The Constituent Power, and he said, like you said, the constituent power is always there, is always present, but this is a fiction. I think the only way is to abandon this notion, because how then you can maintain or seriously state that the constituent power is there? Do you think that the constituent power is there in France, United States, Germany? There is in no state today, or either you are an hypocrite paid by the state, or it's impossible to say that the constituent power is there. It's ridiculous. No? And this was exactly Benjamin's problem. No? When Benjamin, in this 21 essay on violence, on the critique of violence, he begins precisely by saying, we have these two poles, a violence which produces the law. It doesn't employ the expression constituent power, that's the same, and a violence which is constituted law. There are two forms of violence. But then it clearly states this produces an eternal dialectics between these two poles, and only if we find a position which will stop and neutralize this opposition, we will get to the point of what a real violence is. So I agree totally with Benjamin. We have to leave. If we stick to the position of a constituent power and a constituted power, a violence that makes the law, and the law, a violence which conserves the law, which is our idea. No, idea is that. But there was, every state has a beginning of violence. This violence grounds the law. Then there is a violence which conserves the law, the police, and the parliament, etc. But to think that modern European parliament or are a constituent power, this is false. This is a lie. This is a lie.
So thinking, and then going back to the idea of indifference, how does that relate to the idea of chaos?
The idea of?
The idea of chaos. You know,
Chaos?
Chaos. Because it seems like, there's a saying the universe is indifferent to us, so it's like this,
It depends how to conceive the chaos. If you conceive it as a presupposition, you have again a figure like that, but if you conceive it as a...
I conceive it or I imagine it
as a point of indifference. The chaos could be a point of indifference.
Yeah, so it goes back to this idea of these things not ever being static and ever generating.
Yeah, no, this problem, I think you agree, is very interesting because it's a problem which really is at the very core of the political life of the modern states. This duality, constituent power and constituted power. But why? We must not forget that I did not take this example to enter a very interesting political problem, but just to show that perhaps what is false here is the idea of thinking a constituent through discovery, thinking by means of discovery, a constituent subject and a constituted power. Because what we lose here is the idea of the auto-constitution. Perhaps we should think then how a subject or a power constitutes itself as constituent. How? We say, as if it was there is a constituent power, constituent subject, and constituted power and constituted subject. Yes, but how, on the contrary, the interesting point is to think what is a subject who constitutes itself as constituent and not as constituted? Because the false idea is that the implied idea is that there is a subject who constitutes itself as constituted. No, we have to think a subject who constitutes itself as constituent. But this is more difficult, and I think it's that Foucault wants. Foucault tries to attempt, without formulating, he attempts to think a subject who, why is equal to the problem? Because he constitutes itself as constituent and not as constituted.
So
is that clear? Yes.
So is in Aristotle terms this the relationship between potency and act?
Yeah, probably there could be an analogy, no? Because these are the two figures of being for Aristotle, potentiality and actuality, dunamis and ergeia, and they also are in a very strange relationship. If we take it like that, cannot function. You're right in a way. No? If we really think there is first a potentiality, then this potentiality passes in actuality, realizes itself, then it exists no more. No? Perhaps there is an analogy we should have to think what constitutes a potency as a potency, and not as what now becomes an act. And also, for instance, to understand what an act of creation is. Same problem. We have to think a potency of creating, which will not simply exhaust itself in the creation, in the work. Because otherwise, why a work of art should be interested if there is no more any potentiality? But if we think a potentiality is able to constitute itself as potentiality, but this now we are complicating again. But this analogy, to go back to a problem, is how to think a subject who will constitute itself as constituent, not as real self, and not as an objectivized self. Self is never an object. Yes?
In a sense, it produces a very difficult and complex problem, because if you consider the constituent to operate in the register of the arche, the ground, the principe, then that becomes a metaphysic. Or